Would like to welcome all of you to our series of conversations on biopolitics and democracy. In these conversations, we aim at exploring the political tensions that we experience in the challenging times we're living, the challenging times of the pandemic. Our aim is to raise awareness of the political dimensions and the ways in which states and society are dealing with the current global health crisis. We also seek to understand the changes that the pandemic is bringing upon our forms of life. And would also like to propose a collective, critical exercise of political imagination on the possible futures after the pandemic. We're delighted to have Bernard Harcourt with us today. Welcome, Bernard. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Federico. Thanks, Daniele.
Bernard is a critical theorist and a social justice advocate, and he's professor of law and political science at Columbia University. He's also the founding director of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought and directeur d'études at l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Bernard is the author of The Counter-Revolution, How a Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens from 2018, and he has recently published a new book, Critique and Praxis, A Critical Philosophy of Illusions, Values and Action, about which we hope to hear more today. I'll start straight away with the first question, and then Daniele will pick up from there. In your recent book, Critique and Praxis, you propose an image of critical theory based on critical practices and critical engagements with the present. What does it mean to speak of critical praxis in the context of the pandemic?
Right. Thanks, Federico. I mean, that's a really important question because the pandemic has transformed so much about the way that we think about our engagements today. I mean, from just from the fact, for instance, of the more meaningful risk situation that is associated with protest, for instance, protest in the street. Last summer, we saw in the United States an enormous movement for Black lives that erupted in the wake of the heinous, terrible police shootings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and a real movement on the streets that, in a way, was one of the things that was remarkable about it was that it was taking place during the pandemic, and so the calculus, the risk, the involvement, the engagement was so much greater because people were so close, protesting and exposing themselves to risk. So the pandemic has, in many ways, changed things. I mean, one of the great paradoxes, of course, if you take a step back, and this ties to your particular interest in biopolitics and biopower, is that in this moment, in this pandemic moment, there's a paradox that it's the left that has been enforcing the kinds of disciplinary power and relations of power that conventionally have been criticized by the left. In other words, Agamben's original misstep, or when he originally came out against any kind of biopower and disciplinary forms of biopower and discipline in response to the pandemic. I mean, it was interesting because that reflected the ordinary intuition that we would have expected, kind of a critique of biopower. And I mean, I know that your work has been so important in this regard, and I agree with you so much that so much of what has been said in the wake of the pandemic regarding biopolitics has been vague and repetitive, and as you yourself were critiquing it in some of your writings, I think that's right. But the language was there, and it was deployed, and of course, Agamben's original deployment of it as a critique, I think, was the ordinary first intuition that one would have had. So the pandemic, in a way, flipped. I mean, there's a paradox. It flipped the ordinary ways of thinking and critiquing, resulting in the fact that it's many on the left who are, in a way, enforcing forms of power, by contrast to those very much on the right or on the far right, in Texas or in Alabama and Mississippi, who are, in a sense, defying all of the forms of enforced order. It's almost as if it's the right that is engaging in forms of disobedience from a mesh that is embraced by those on the left. So I think it's created a lot of paradoxes and a lot of challenges for us to think through. Just one thing before we go into conversation. I think it's also the pandemic has accentuated the digital divide, and in the process accentuated the issues of race, predominantly of race, ethnicity, in this country, that in part contributed to the movement for Black Lives over the course of the past few months. But it really did accentuate the digital divide, because most of the privileged and most of the wealthy or more fortunate persons among us were able to find shelter in the digital space, whereas those who were less fortunate had to expose themselves really to the virus, if they were, working the cashiers, or if they were delivering food, or all the manual labor, and that is something that it's not new by any stretch of the imagination. We know the inequalities, but somehow it brought them to the fore, and particularly along issues of race. And as a result, I think we saw both the movement for Black Lives in the United States and more globally as well. And also, maybe from my perspective, what we saw was an even greater need for what I would think of as a notion of cooperation, ultimately, to get us, to move us forward. Yeah.
Thank you. I agree, and that's very important. And perhaps there's a link between this notion of cooperation and a second question that we wanted to ask you. So you mentioned this kind of very weird, strange tension between a biopolitics that seems to take on a positive meaning as the care of life and the care of the population, and like something that is becomes defended by the left, right? So a tension between this and the idea that some of our democratic practices have been transformed in the past year and a half, right? And something that you do in your book, Critique and Praxis, so well is precisely to focus on practices before focusing on theories. And so linking this to the question of cooperation, the second question that we wanted to ask you was, how do you think the pandemic has impacted and is impacting democracy and democratic practices? I would say both in the way in which we think of democracy, but also in the way in which we practice democracy, and perhaps pushing democracy with these new practices of cooperation a step further, or in directions that we didn't know before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I think it's important to kind of deconstruct the notion of democracy a little bit, and I think it's a term that we often deploy a little bit too easily, or at least, or a term that that has so many different valences, that we could be speaking about different things when we're speaking, when we're in conversation with each other, really. This year I've been focusing my work mostly on W.E.B. Du Bois's notion of abolition democracy. And we've been running the series, which you both participated in. Thank you so much. On the punitive society. So the year was about abolition democracy and the different dimensions of abolishing the prison, the police, family regulation, etc., and including the punitive society, as we were discussing. And what I particularly like about W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of abolition democracy is that it inflects the notion of democracy with a particular substantive content and ethical, and a political direction. And so it's not, in effect, it's not simply the majority vote, which can often be associated with notions of democracy. I mean, obviously, there are also counter-majoritarian elements to democratic theory. But what Du Bois adds or inflects is this idea of a democratic process that requires work in order to achieve its ambition. And it requires particular kinds of institutions, particular kind of working together, and the creation of institutions to allow those who have been traditionally disadvantaged. And of course, he's writing in the context of post-slavery, so he's writing in the context of freed Black persons who have been traditionally disadvantaged, to become part of the democratic process. And that seems important to me. Now, Du Bois himself, actually, the same year that he was writing the text, Black Reconstruction in America, 1935, which gives birth to the notion of abolition democracy, he also writes a short text called A Negro Nation Within the Nation, where he calls for cooperation, he calls for cooperatives, and he calls for a separatist cooperative society within African-American community. And it's that relationship between thinking about abolition democracy, so a particular kind of way of thinking about democracy, and cooperation that seems so important. His point was that you can't achieve democratic forms without first lifting and putting on an equal footing different communities. And the way to do that is through forms of cooperation. Particularly, he was thinking of cooperatives. And so I find that very enlightening and inspiring in terms of thinking about democracy. Now, it raises the question, which you're posing, of how does the pandemic change this in a way? And here I think that it has changed things predominantly through the avenue of the digital realm. It's changed things because so much of our democratic engagement has funneled us through these forms of virtual communication, right? I mean, here we are, we're on Zoom, right? The three of us are on Zoom. We've been on Zoom for a year and a half now. Most of our democratic engagement, most of our debates, most of our conversations are now virtual. We are not in the, we are not in the agora anymore. We are not facing each other. We're now, and that has important implications, I think, for democracy and the tensions between kind of securitarian care of life aspects and democratic practices. And I think that I would think of it this way, and in part this relates to the earlier analysis I had proposed regarding the expository society, which so basically the work in the book Exposed, or in Nécessité d'Exposition, where I tried to show the way in which society had changed as a result of the digital era, as a result of social media, as a result of Google, as a result of all of the surveillance and all of the exposure that we do voluntarily, willingly, lovingly, as we tweet and Instagram and search on Google and buy things online, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's been, as a result of the pandemic, a real pendulum swing. And I think we started somewhat before the pandemic in a way worried, concerned about the digital age, about the expository society. I mean, we were worried about the fact that we were revealing all of our information, at least some of us, with our iPhone, or Google Maps, the fact that all of those platforms were then being kind of directly kind of accessed by the U.S. government, by the NSA, went tapped directly into the servers of Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Yahoo, Paltalk, YouTube, Skype, AOL, Apple, etc. Right? We were worried about this expository society, and it become a world of total information, really, of total information awareness through the digital age. But from one day to the next with the pandemic, this space literally became a haven, right? This digital space, living in a digital bubble, became our escape almost from certain death, right? And it's important to, it's hard to remember, but it's hard to remember because we don't like to remember traumatic experiences. But I mean, I'm sitting here at Columbia on 116th in Amsterdam, and just one block down from here, there were trucks that were mobile morgues parked in front of the hospital, and you would walk down the street and there would be these refrigerator trucks of morgues parked in front of the hospital. And so all of a sudden it really did feel that this expository society, or this space, this digital space, was the refuge, our only refuge. We all downloaded Zoom. We turned our offices and our homes into our offices. We turned our homes into our classrooms. Some people turned them into their trading floors for, stock market transactions. I mean, and everybody who was privileged, and this is where the digital divide really was so sharp, sought refuge in this digital space. It was almost as if we didn't want to expose ourselves to the virus, and all of a sudden we were completely willing to expose ourselves to the surveillance. And it was those who were unfortunate, who weren't able to shelter in place, but had to continue working, who were the ones who were exposed now, of course, but exposed to the virus. And so I think from one moment to another, this digital space, which had been a source of concern, became a salvation for so many people. But after a year of this living in a digital space, I think it has transformed the way we think about the virtual world, and in an interesting way, because more than ever, it feels now that we want to take a step back from the virtual world. I mean, we've learned some lessons about this, about living in a digital space. We've learned first about the impotence of digital technology, right? Because we thought that this was going to save us. We thought that you could do contact tracing. Everybody would, this was the perfect test of, in some sense, biopolitical digital technology, right? Contact tracing, right? I mean, if everybody, this was the test of applications that would have allowed us to know exactly everybody that you've been close to, what your risk level is, and basically, nobody wanted to do that. Nobody wanted to do that because they knew that all these companies were really only trying to get our information and our personal data, right? And so complete lack of trust that kind of popped this bubble of what technology could be. I think second, it showed the kind of the shallowness of the digital, in the sense that everybody just realized that it's just not the same thing as being in the same room with people. It used to be that we used to dream about, virtual worlds and virtual games and wearing hoods and glasses and casks that would be completely virtual. And now it's almost as if it's like enough of this world. We want to actually just see someone and have a cup of coffee with them. And I mean, there's Zoom exhaustion, there's depression, there's isolation, screen fatigue. So it's a completely different relationship. And then third and finally, right, we noticed how much of that digital space we lived in was complete noise and a complete and utter waste of time. I think we saw this particularly with, Donald Trump's Twitter, right? How all of a sudden now Donald Trump's Twitter has been closed and his Facebook has been closed since he departed from the White House. And just what sense of collective relief we have that, that this is not going on, that we're not being distracted every day with a different, Twitter storm coming from Trump. I mean, we realize all of a sudden that so much of this digital world that we live in is just a complete distraction and a muddled morass that's trying to kind of bring us in. So I think there has been kind of this pendulum swing in the relationship to the digital space and the digital world, which of course affects democracy and democratic exchange, and more than ever, I think we are starting to question the virtues and the values of the expository society. But what it's doing in a way is it's undermining that desire and libidinal pull towards the digital. Now, whether what will happen long term is another matter. But I think that it is in the process of shifting us on the relationship to social media and to the digital, which has shaped so much our politics and our democratic politics today. Yeah.
Thanks, Bernard. That was very interesting. Thinking about what you just said, I was just wondering, thinking about this idea of the digital as this refuge, right? And also a sort of paradoxical place where, you take refuge you protect yourself from the virus, but you also expose yourself to a whole series of other instances and maybe risks, right? But I was thinking of what you said of a certain transformation of the forms of collaboration that the sort of refuge that the digital offered sort of produced, right? So we see a sort of a greater mobility or flexibility of the forms of conversation, and even of labor in a certain way, of intellectual labor, for example, right? And also all forms of production that depend on these sort of resources. So the three of us are here now talking and collaborating in a way. Now, so we noticed this sort
in
of
a way that
transformation.
wouldn't, right, you're right, Federica, in a way that wouldn't have been possible before, right?
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
So my question to you is, you think that, right, we've experienced this transformation and now we're sort of facing a sort of exhaustion of that sort of collaboration, or does that mean that we've learned something that's now qualitatively different and that will somehow inspire us, or that will lead us to other forms of collaboration beyond the digital? Do you think that this is a transformation that will take place? Do you think that from this experience something will change in the way we, I don't know, politically organize or talk intellectually, so on and so forth, beyond the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a challenge to see how the world is transformed beyond the pandemic, and to start imagining what critique and praxis will look like after the pandemic. I think that there are these technical issues that are at play. So questions about how will our modes of interaction change? Will we be able to integrate in a positive way the advantages that we've discovered? And yeah, I don't want to sound too negative. There are certain advantages that just the mere fact that, Daniele, you're in the Netherlands, and Federico, you're in the UK, and, I'm here in New York City, and that we can have this conversation seamlessly. This year during the 1313, during the Abolition Democracy 1313, there were abilities to integrate, for instance, artistic work and artistic production that would have been practically impossible to integrate in an analog space. We were able to bring in opera. We were able to bring in a drum circle from Standing Rock, which we wouldn't have been able to do that under normal circumstances, under analog circumstances. So I do think that there are dimensions that can be captured and brought to help us with our forms of critique and with our forms of praxis. There's a whole debate about the democratic potential of social media, which it remains unresolved. It flourished as a result of the the Arab Spring in 2011, etc., where there was a whole questioning as to whether or not social media was facilitating protest and critical praxis, or whether it's facilitating the repression. And I think the jury is still out on that. These are technologies that serve both purposes, both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary functions very well. And the jury is a little bit out on that. But I think that one aspect that we need to think about kind of post-pandemic is going to be a return to crises that have taken second seat to the pandemic in a way. And I'm thinking particularly of global climate change, which global climate change was, from sitting here in the United States, it took second seat in part because we had a presidency and a president who was a global climate change denier. And so we saw 4 years of kind of demolition of efforts to address the climate. But I think that during the pandemic, we've been, of course, more focused on the questions of virus transmission, of vaccinations, than we have been on the question of climate change. And so as we start imagining possibilities for critical praxis after the pandemic, I think it's going to, in part, return us to particular problem areas that have been somewhat sidelined by the devastation, really, of this pandemic. And I mean, you see it well right now. I mean, the devastation in India, the devastation in South America that's going on right now is preoccupying and takes, you know, takes rightly our attention. I think migration crises as well have gotten less attention because of the pandemic. So I think that there are going to be both technological changes in the way in which we can engage in critique and engage in critical praxis as a result of some of the effervescence of this digital space that we created. But I also think that there will be a need to recalibrate and think about those other dimensions, those other political dimensions that to a certain extent have been sidelined as a result of the pandemic.
Yes, I agree with that, Bernard. So we probably just have one last minute, and perhaps I just wanted to. So in your book, Critique and Praxis, you kind of focus the attention on the question, what more shall I do? And on a kind of, you know, critical, ethical question about myself instead of setting the rules and the laws for the others. And perhaps I was just curious to ask you, since you kind of suggest in the book that that is a question that you ask yourself kind of regularly. When you ask yourself this question now, is there something that comes to mind, you know, like in the next months for you, something in terms of your critical practices in the near future that you want to share very briefly with us?
Yeah, thanks, Daniele. I mean, that's a really important question because one of the things that I felt immediately with the pandemic, when the pandemic hit, was the urgency of the need to be posing that question, what more am I to do? I had felt that urgency growing with times. I felt that urgency growing with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, with the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Modi in India, and Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, the global shift towards authoritarianism, as that was going on in the mid 2010s, I felt the urgency of the question, what more am I to do, hit me harder and harder. But I'll have to say that when the pandemic hit and all of a sudden everything that I was doing was in a way canceled, it hit even harder because I felt so viscerally that I was engaged in so many activities that weren't sufficiently praxis oriented. And so it almost feels as if the succession of crises that we've faced, the turn to authoritarianism, the neoliberal turn in the aughts and in the last decade as well at a global level, the immigration crisis, but then the pandemic on top of it really made me feel about a greater urgency for critical praxis, and a greater urgency for the question of what am I to do? What am I to do? And I'll have to say that it has turned a little bit my critical praxis upside down. Right now, I'm very much involved with putting into place, creating a collaboration here at the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought, a collaboration that is called the Initiative for a Just Society, and bringing in collaborators and bringing in a cooperative way others who are trying to address these issues as well, in order to create more conversation, more interaction, more praxis as a collective. And of course, that then raises the question, how does scholarship, how does writing, how does critique fit in with those forms of praxis? And I'll have to say, I'm at a juncture where I'm very much struggling with that right now. On these questions, the ones that I tend to be focused on are questions of punishment and abolition of the punitive society. And you know, recently I was writing about it. I think maybe this will be where I'll end. I was writing about it many times. When I think about a world without punishment, I often turn to this section in Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. It's the second essay. I think it's in the section 10 of the second essay, where he talks about whether one could imagine a society that is so powerful that it would not need to punish. And then he, in his typical way, Nietzsche kind of creates a conversation. He says, you know, that it's basically the society talking to itself and saying, you know, what are my parasites to me? You know, let them live and thrive. I'm strong enough for that. And I had always used that as my way of thinking about a world without punishment. But it doesn't seem to work anymore for me, in part because Nietzsche refers to the disorderly as a parasite. And that is what's giving me pause right now and causing the most difficulty for me, is how to think through critical praxis and critique with thinkers who have done so much to help us move forward with critique, and nevertheless maintained in their conceptual toolboxes, in their language, expressions and ideas that seem to no longer be acceptable or tolerable today, right? And that's causing, for me, an enormous amount of friction and hesitation as to how to engage properly in critique. And maybe this is, you know, this is what I argue for in critique and praxis, is this constant confrontation of critique and praxis. And in a way, it's the praxis right now, particularly the praxis of coming from the movement for Black Lives, coming from the abolitionist authors, Mariam Kaba, Dorothy Roberts, Ruthie Gilmore, who are kind of forcing us to ask difficult questions about some of the assumptions and expressions and ways of thinking of what are, to me, the most productive critical thinkers. And so, I feel as if it's a particularly difficult time right now.
It definitely is. Well, and definitely this question of, the necessity of a certain epistemic humility, perhaps, in our critical thinking, knowing that the language that critical thinkers in the past have used now seems so outdated or even wrong. Like a knowing that we might be doing the same thing, but at the same time kind of accepting the risk, right? It's perhaps part of the
Right.
critical thinking and the critical practice and kind of pushing forward things.
Right.
So
Right.
thank you so much for really your generosity, your time, for thinking in front of us and sharing your thoughts about this. It was a great pleasure. Thanks everybody for watching, those who are gonna watch this recording, and we'll continue this series of conversations. But thanks, Bernard, so much.
Thank you, Daniele, and thank you, Federico. It was great to be in conversation with you, and good luck with this project.
Thank you.
Thanks.